So we're walking through this series on Philippians, the peace of God. And every once in a while, we like to use text from The Message. The Message is Eugene Peterson's, I say contemporary paraphrase of the scripture, but The Message is more than 20 years old now. And maybe you've spent some time with it back then or recently or whatever the case may be. I really love The Message. I think it's really helpful and life-giving, especially with familiar passages. And then occasionally I will come across something in The Message that either I had forgotten or I hadn't seen before. So I want to pick up in Philippians 1 this morning using some of Eugene Peterson's paraphrase. This is Philippians 1 and verse 9 in The Message. Paul writes and says, "This is my prayer, that your love will flourish and that you will not only love much, but love well. Learn to love appropriately. You need to use your head and test your feelings so that your love is sincere and intelligent, not sentimental gush." It's as if God handed the pen to the parent of a high schooler who's in love for the first time, you know? It's like, you need to use your head, kid. None of that. The Bible's against sentimental gush. I also, I like that as an ad for a church, you know? Like here at Powell Church, our love is sincere and intelligent. None of that sentimental gush. Sundays, 9:30 and 11. I really like that. All right, Here's the rest of the passage. He writes, it's still in The Message, live a lover's life, circumspect, exemplary. Live a life Jesus will be proud of, bountiful in fruits from the soul, making Jesus Christ attractive to all, and getting everyone involved in the glory and praise of God. Can we leave that up there for just a second? Consider the weight of the idea of a life Jesus would be proud of. Because for some of us, theologically, we might really struggle with the idea that that is even possible. We might think to ourselves, like, no, man, like a life Jesus will be proud of, like maybe a life Jesus isn't disgusted by, I can do. Maybe a life Jesus tolerates. But a life Jesus can be proud of, I'm not sure that's for me. As we're walking through this series on peace, I mean, again, there's a lot you don't need me to tell you about peace and anxiety. Sometimes, theologically, when we approach it from that perspective, when our awareness of our own sin is greater than our awareness of God's grace and what it does in our lives, sometimes in faith, in Christianity, in churches of all kinds of different names, we can just kind of operate with a low-grade anxiety of like, have I messed this up in the last 5 minutes? Have I sinned in the last 5 minutes? And then that little voice that's like, probably, you know, like that version of that. Sometimes we can tell ourselves on one end of the spectrum, no, man, I don't know if a life Jesus will be proud of is something I'm capable of, and that itself can cause anxiety. Then sometimes theologically on the other end of the spectrum with this, when we think about phrases like, well done, good and faithful servant, we can think that a life that Jesus would be proud of is only something that we can really have or receive at the end. When we die and we hope to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. But a lot of times, that destination, that answer theologically is simply a byproduct of what we believe, right? That if we put our faith in Jesus Christ, we get to go to the good place instead of the bad place when we die. And when we go to the good place, we can hear, well done, good and faithful servant. So even in that, there's this sense that, well, I don't know if a life Jesus will be proud of is something for me now, maybe when I get to the end, just by the virtue of believing in him. What do we do with this? I think it's helpful to look at what Eugene Peterson does with it, which is to say, a life Jesus will be proud of is fruitful, and a life Jesus will be proud of is somehow connected to this idea of making Jesus attractive to all, and that gets everyone involved in glory and in praise. There's something about a life that Jesus will be proud of that's connected to this idea of our relationships, the way we connect our faith to the people around us, and making Jesus Christ attractive to all. Now again, right away, there may be some of us that are like, I'm too sinful for that. And maybe that's a good point for our own reflection and our own anxiety. But what I would say is, do you know what doesn't make Jesus Christ attractive to all? Is jail. And Paul writes this under house arrest. Those early Christians, Paul included, they knew this kind of thing well. This isn't the first time that Paul has been detained. Now, Paul has a history of getting out. He's got a history of angels and earthquakes and miraculous things that you can read about in the book of Acts where he was being detained or others were being detained, and then God did a very specific, very grand thing, and then they were no longer detained. But we also know, traditionally, that Paul's life on earth is going to end with his execution. That is the road that many of these early Christ followers end up walking themselves. It's okay to believe that that does not necessarily make Jesus attractive to all. And yet in the midst of that, even knowing suffering well, even knowing, as we talked about last week, that peace and comfort not always equal, even knowing all of that well, they also knew the good news so well, they could say it this way. Here's the next passage in Philippians 9, starting in verse 12. This is still the message. I want to report to you, friends, that my imprisonment here has had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of being squelched, the message has actually prospered. All the soldiers here and everyone else too found out I'm in jail because of this Messiah. That piqued their curiosity. Now they've all learned about Jesus. Not only that, most of the followers of Jesus here have become far more sure of themselves in the faith than ever, speaking out fearlessly about God, about the Messiah. Paul says this thing that they did to stop the spread of the good news actually had the opposite of its intended effect. I'm going to spend some time, most of our time this morning, just considering the word actually. Because what percentage of your life goes exactly the way you thought it would? Like if you had to put a number on it, what would that even be, right? Is it 10%? What is the percentage of your life and your day where you're like, man, I thought this was going to go this way, and I was right every time. Every moment, every interaction, every prayer, large or small, it went exactly the way I thought it was going to go. Consider the percentage of our lives that occupy that actually space. I thought this was going to happen, but actually, this happened. Or I thought this was going to happen, and actually, now I'm way over here. And sometimes that is, they tried to put a stop to something good, or something tried to put a stop to something good, or I was really anxious about something. But actually, it turned out okay. And sometimes that actually is a blindsiding thing that it's right there in the word we don't even see coming, that takes our life from this direction to kind of a whole other set of conversations. Now, these guys, these early Christians, they didn't just know, they believed it so fully, they communicated in these ways. Live a life that is attractive to all. The message is actually prospering. What they believed for sure is that because of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that their ultimate outcome was secure. But their day-to-day is still very up in the air. And even for Paul, who, gets out of jail a lot, even for Paul, this thing is headed in a direction that might not be attractive to all. So we can know our ultimate outcome. We can know our ultimate end result. But even in Christ, even as we sang so beautifully this morning in that first song, it's hard for us to know exactly, even us Christians, it's hard for us to know exactly how today is going to go. Like exactly, We can put our faith, and do put our faith in this ultimate outcome, but our day-to-day actuallys, our day-to-day lives are much less certain. But consider as well how we might see God moving in and through all of those actuallys, whether they go this way or that way. My wife and I have been married for almost 10 years. Alex and I are together in part because of one of the dumbest things I have ever done in my whole life. I appreciate the trust. You don't even know what it is yet. I appreciate you trusting me and saying, like, this is a pretty dumb thing. I became a pastor in 2006, 17 years ago. I was 24. As I've talked about before, I lived in Knoxville my whole life, and my first appointment was in Ceres, Virginia. It was in the middle of nowhere. Ceres was 35 minutes from a Walmart. That's the best way I know to describe its proximity to anything else. Like a good Methodist, I started in Ceres on July 1st, and in September, I got asked to preach a revival. And man, did that make my head swell 3 sizes that day. I was like, I've been doing this 3 months and already getting asked to preach a revival. Look at me, 24, I'm on my way, baby. This revival was a good Appalachian holler kind of revival. 5 nights, different speaker every night. My night to preach was Thursday. There's also a truth, I think, not just for pastors, but just for anything. Like when you start a new job, or especially if you start a new career and like it's the career, you know, it's the thing you really want to do. You do things when you start that you would never do later on. You're so full of energy and life and all this stuff that a lot of it, we're just above and beyond kinds of people. So what I decided is, because I was feeling above and beyond and with a big giant head 3 months on the job, I thought, I'm going to go down early. Revival's all week. I'm going to go down the night before, check it out, get the vibe so I can know kind of exactly what sort of revival I'm dealing with and that sort of thing. And I'm going to show up early, right? Because you start, like, I'm early everywhere. These days, I'm on time everywhere, but I'm not like 30 minutes early the way you do when you first start something. Ceres was 35 minutes from Walmart. This is 17 years ago. This didn't exist. If it did, it would have been as worthless as, you know, a brick in Ceres because there was no GPS, there's no cell service. So I had to ask, how do you get to this church? And I asked people who'd lived there for 1,000 years, and they gave me directions like people when you live a place 1,000 years that are like, you can't miss it. You go here, you go down here, you go over here, you turn this way, you go down here, you go here. You look to your left, there's a school, and the church is right across the street from the school, which is true. But when I drove down, the night before I was supposed to preach, when I drove down and I went there and went here and did this and went there and all that other stuff, and I looked to my left and I saw the school. The church is across the street from the school, but you can't see it from that road. There's a hill in the way, big old hill. Riverside United Methodist Church in maybe Rich Valley, Virginia. Some old-time Methodists may know where that is, but you can't see it from the road. So I just thought, nope, must not be it, and kept driving. And kept driving, and kept driving. Soon I ended up in Saltville, Virginia. If you've ever been there, Saltville is... I started the night in 1 county, and now I was 2 counties over. And you think, wow, what an idiot. Nope, what I was thinking is, Billy Graham, look out, baby, because now they know me 3 counties over, and I've only been doing this for 3 months. And because I was so early, I wasn't late yet, so I thought, I kid you not. I pull into Saltville, I look to the left, there's a school. Across the street from the school is a church. That church has a sign out front that says, revival, every night this week. So I think to myself, this is the place. I don't bother with, light details like, what is the name of this church? Or, what denomination is this church? Which, I just, when I tell the story, I always say, I don't wish to embarrass anyone. I will just say that I have not been to a church service in this denomination before or since. So now, it's getting to, I'm a minute or two late, and I kind of just duck in and sit down, and the pastor stands up and says, welcome to night 3 of my 5-part series on whatever. And I'm like, oh, man, I am in the wrong place. Now, this is a good-sized church here. I don't know how many of you have spent any time in a small country church. You don't have to go far from here to find a small country church at all. If you've ever been in a small country church and you were in your 20s, and the average age of the room before you walked in it started with at least a 7. When I walked in and sat down, I can feel all their eyes, right? And I'm looking around, and I'm like, okay, I'm in the wrong place. This is incredibly embarrassing. But the door is right there. All these people are old. When this is over, I can get out this door and in my car and gone before anyone talks to me, before anyone tries to introduce me to their great-granddaughter or any of these things. And like, I'm gone and no one will ever know that this happened. And about that time, I'd only been the pastor there 3 months. In that time, there was a woman in one of my churches who had fallen and broken her hip. And I had visited her in the hospital like that day or the day before. And the nurse that was there in the hospital walked into that revival and sat down right next to me and goes, "What are you doing here?" And I panicked and I thought for a second, what would Jesus do? And then I thought, never mind, forget that. So I lied. I said, well, I just came to spread the tidings of peace and joy from the United Methodist Church to your denomination here. And then when it ended, we're just going to leave that there and try not to spill my water. Then when it ended, of course, I couldn't get away because that nurse was there. So all these people come up and start talking to me, and they're like, "It is so great that a Methodist pastor would come from 3 counties over just to come and be with us." And I was like, praise the Lord, yeah, and then all that good stuff. So anyway, I got back in my car. I ended up somehow back on I-81 in Chilhowie, Virginia, which is about an hour from my house. And I remember calling my dad from the McDonald's drive-thru in Chilhowie, Virginia, and saying, at some point in time, this is going to be a pretty decent story. Right now, it's just, embarrassing and all that. I got the right directions. I ended up in the revival, the right revival at the right church the next night. I told that story. Everybody loved it. I told it in my church on Sunday morning. The husband of the woman who fell and broke her hip went to the hospital and told the nurse. She did not think that was funny whatsoever. But anyway, that was 3 months into being a pastor. 5 years later, I met Alex. We met on a United Methodist leadership team. So romantic, I know. There was a pastor from every district and a layperson from every district. So I was the pastor from the district where I was in Virginia, and she was the layperson where she was in Athens, Tennessee. And so we met, and I thought she's cute and all that good stuff. But we were 4.5 hours away from each other. I was finishing seminary, so we just became friends. A year after that, I got asked to do a devotional at a pastor's retreat. And I thought to myself, you know what story a room full of pastors will think is hilarious is, me getting lost and going to the wrong revival. And I stood up at that retreat and I told that story. It's one of the dumbest things, clearly, like one of the dumbest things that I've ever done. And the next morning, the senior pastor from a church came up to me and said, "Hey, we're going to have an opening for an associate pastor in contemporary worship at our church. Is that something you would be interested in doing?" And I said, I know a girl that goes to that church. And because I stood up and told that stupid story about the dumbest thing that I have ever done in my life, I got sent to be the associate pastor at the church where Alex was. And I got 2 kids now, and we've been married for almost 10 years. Now, there are 1,000 or 1,000,000 or an uncountable number of other hinges in that story, right? Do you know how many of them I know? Very few. There are 1,000 days between one end of that story and the other. There are all of these days that unfold before our lives. And how many of them go exactly the way you think they're going to go? And sometimes something real dumb that you do can turn into this incredible and beautiful thing. And sometimes it actually goes the other way. The truth of our lives is that there are a lot of actualities in our stories, and they are hard to predict. And we can know the ultimate outcome. Thanks be to God for that. But along the way, between here and the gates of heaven, it's hard for us to know exactly every hinge in that story. It's hard for us to know most of them. So what can we know? As a group of people that seek peace and are seeking to try to figure out what we're doing, what makes Jesus attractive to all when there's a lot that we don't know? Here's how that Philippians first chapter ends, a few verses down in Philippians 1 and verse 27. Paul writes this in Philippians 1:27. He says, "Only live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ." Live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or I'm absent and hear about you, I will know that you are standing firm in one spirit, striving side by side with one mind for the faith of the gospel. He ends the chapter the same way he began it. Live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel, so that whether I come see you or I'm absent and I hear about you. What he's implying in saying, whether I come see you or I don't, the implication there is whether I get out of this or not. Because Paul gets out of prison a lot. And he writes and says, I might come see you. But the implication is, maybe this goes a different way. But whether it does or it doesn't, live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. What is a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ? What's a life Jesus can be proud of? When we can know ultimately a thing, but we can know less than we want for the day to day. What can we know? If peace is not just a thing we believe in, but a thing to participate in, what can we do? I think it goes back to what he says is tied directly to a life Jesus would be proud of. Live a lover's life. Love not just much, but well. And not this sentimental gush, which is to say, I think, maybe it's not so much about how we feel all the time, because how I feel all the time can be a bit unsteady. And when we talk about peace, sometimes what we're putting language to is feelings. And man, feelings are great. But what's even more potent is action. I know where this is headed. I believe where this is headed. I don't know where today's headed. But what I can know and what I can do is seek to love well. When we talk about anxiety, sometimes people come to us as pastors and things and say, I want to know God's will for my life. And I often say, that's great. I want to know God's will for my life too. And usually when we ask that question, we're looking big picture. Yeah? Do I take this job or not? Do I ask her to marry me or move away? I'm sure there's better options than that off the top of my head. But you know what I mean? Like, what do I do in this specific thing, this big thing that's going to define what is God's will for my life? And sometimes God shares us those things in ways that are meaningful and real to us. And I bet a lot of us have got a story like that, where we said to ourselves, I knew this is what God wanted me to do. But not every time. And sometimes it's hard for us to know how to pray for each other or how to help each other. But when people ask that question, what is God's will for my life? A lot of times what I find myself saying is, I don't know. Let's talk more and let's hear more and let's think about how we can pray and let's think about what you want. And we'll talk more about that next week. But when it comes to what God's will for our lives is, here's what I do know for sure. In addition to the ultimate outcome stuff, what I do know for sure is that God calls you to love well today. That's God's will for your life. Jesus, for all this mystery, for all this flowery language and all that stuff, and Jesus is a very mysterious guy. But when they ask him what is most important, he's not mysterious. When they ask him what's most important, he says, love God with everything you have and love your neighbor as yourself. There's a lot of our life that hangs out in the actually space, or things that may be coming that we can't even see or perceive yet. But what we put our faith in is in who Jesus Christ is in the midst of every storm and in the midst of every blessing. And the ultimate outcome that secures for us. And the action behind that faith is today I can try to love well. Not sentimental gushmate, not feelings based, because today you may not be feeling it. But how can I love God well today? How can I love others well today? And remember, that verse is love your neighbor as you love yourself. How can you love yourself well today? We talked about DoorDash and things last week. Maybe not how can you love yourself much today. How can you love yourself well today? Part of how we participate in peace is in the midst of uncertainties and 1,000 million billion actualities. I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe he's still on the throne. I believe there's meaning in all of these actualities, even if I can't see it or sense it or know it. And even when I want to, man, when I want to. But I believe he's put a good, fruitful life before us, not just at the end, but for today, one that is centered on, can I love God well today? Can I love you well today? And can I love me well today? Part of the path of peace is seeking to love each other well in the midst of all of these moments that we may not fully understand. And believing that God is with us in each of them. That, in some small way, that's what makes Jesus Christ attractive to all. It's a stubborn insistence on love, even when we do dumb stuff, even when we don't know what to do. And even when our feelings are not what we want them to be, that Christ remains on the throne and invites us to love.